Hi guys, this video is for those of you who are considering making the switch to mirrorless or Sony cameras. I'm a working photographer who's been shooting with Canon for the past 12 years, and in the past year I made the switch from Canon to Sony. I'm going to tell you why I made the switch, how much it cost, what the challenges were, and help you to figure out if it might be the right choice for you. My name's Jon-Mark and I run Jon-Mark Photography here in Victoria, BC, Canada. I shot my first wedding on a Canon Rebel XT back in 2007. And I've been working as a full-time photographer since 2008. During that time, I shot exclusively Canon until 2018, starting with the Rebel XT, then the Canon 40D, the Canon 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III, and lastly the 5D Mark IV before I switched to the Sony A7iii in March of 2018. So this is not going to be your typical quick and short video that's going to tell you to make the switch and what the best thing is. We're going to go into the details of what it's like to use the Sony and what the big differences are using a mirrorless camera versus a traditional DSLR. So after 10 years of shooting with Canon for work, I wanted to see other cameras. I wasn't feeling totally satisfied with what I was getting in terms of autofocus, file quality, all that stuff. Canon's got lots of good things going for it, but it always felt like the grass was greener on the Nikon side of the fence. More recently, Sony had jumped into the game. They had started making these full-frame cameras that were mirrorless, so they were smaller, and they had a few other differences that changed the way that you work with them. Initially, I was attracted to them because of the file quality, because I learned that Sony had been making the sensors for Nikon. But after using them more, I discovered that there were so many other benefits to mirrorless that I had never considered. So while I was still shooting with Canon for work, I decided to pick up a used Sony A7 Mark I. At this point, it was a 5-year-old camera, maybe 4, and I knew that it had the same sensor as the Nikon D750, but in a smaller package. I thought it'd be great to take on hikes, to bring to family events, things like that. Basically, have it as a dedicated personal camera that was cheap enough at the time that I didn't even really need to worry about it. So after shooting with the A7 for a little while, I could see the files were really good, but there was no way that I could use it for work. It was too slow. And maybe that's your experience with a mirrorless camera. Maybe you tried one out in the early days and thought, this isn't really for me. But the thing is, they've come so far since then. When I started considering the switch more seriously was after the A7iii came out from Sony. It's a much more expensive camera, but it was extremely capable and had incredible file quality. If you're a bit of a nerd like me and you followed Jon-Mark and all that stuff, you can see that the Sonys and the Nikons run the top 10 or top 20, and Canon is way behind in that regard. But the thing is, the A7iii was really expensive. Considering the switch was going to be way too expensive to be practical for me once I accounted for buying 2 camera bodies and all the additional lenses that were going to be needed. So when Sony announced the A7iii, I was really excited. It looked like, as far as I could tell, it had 90% of the features of the A7iii, including a better autofocus system from the A9, but it was only about $2,000 US. Now for reference, all the prices I'm going to use in this video are going to be in US dollars. Although I'm in Canada, our prices are really set by the value of the Canadian dollar versus the American dollar. So whenever you hear me say a dollar amount, it's the US dollar price. On that note, let's talk about cost. I decided it was time to switch when I was looking at the cost of upgrading my second camera body from a 5D3 to a 5D4. I was shooting with one 5D4 and I knew that my 5D3s were getting pretty long in the tooth and I wanted all my files to match. So I looked at the cost of another 5D Mark IV at $3,300. I was going, this is pretty expensive. And then the A7iii came out at $2,000 US, and that $1,300 price difference was enough that it would cover any of the losses that I would have from selling my lenses and switching to the Sony options. So that was when I decided to make the jump. So looking at the cost of switching, if I could sell my existing 5D Mark IV and my 5D Mark IIIs, which I still haven't sold, I could really easily cover the cost of making the switch. Another 5D Mark IV was going to be $3,300. I could sell my used one for about $3,000 and then pick up 2 A7 Mark IIIs for $4,000. So once I accounted for the cost of selling my other stuff and making the switch, it was far less expensive to make the switch than to simply buy another Canon 5D Mark IV. That and the cost of the lenses, based on the lenses that I chose to get, ended up making it so that it didn't really cost that much to switch. It was actually pretty easy. I actually ended up buying most of my lenses used online. If you look hard and you find relatively new lenses, there's nothing wrong with buying used and you can save yourself a lot of money. I'm going to talk about lenses a little bit more later, but what you should know from the get-go is that Sony Zeiss lenses tend to be a little bit more expensive than what you may be used to with Canon. The nice thing is that this year, Sigma announced that they were going to make most of their art lenses available natively on the Sony E-mount. If you combine that with some of the mid-range options that Sony options, the switch isn't that expensive. Sony has this expensive line of glass called G Master or GM lenses. They're kind of like Nikon Nikkor or Canon L lenses. And those ones are really pricey. But if you look at a lot of the mid-range ones that are f1.8 glass but are built to the quality of a lot of f1.4 glass, You can get them for the $1,000 range, and they're really quite good, and they're actually much lighter and easier on your wrist than the more expensive, heavy G Master lenses. Speaking of weight, that actually ended up being another side benefit that I hadn't really considered that much when making the switch. As a longtime wedding photographer, I had found that I was getting to the point where I was getting back and wrist pain at the end of long wedding days. Now my kit is a lot lighter and my back and wrist pain has totally gone away. But let's talk about what you're gonna notice once you make that initial switch to Sony, because the cameras are pretty different. Right off the bat, the camera bodies are much smaller. I found they were actually too small. My pinky would always be hanging off the bottom of the camera and I never felt like I really had a great grip on it. So I ended up picking up some grips to begin with. Not the battery grips, but just grip extensions. I originally started with some wooden ones made by JB Camera Designs, but they weren't really that comfortable for me. I ended up with the small rig L-plate grip. You can see here that it extends the bottom of the camera so that it's about the same height as a 5D. If I put this on a table by a 5D, it basically matches it. Now, my pinky finger has a comfortable place to rest, and I haven't really added much weight to the camera. Now, of the buttons and dials on the back of the camera, for me, the most frustrating one is the big control dial on the back. This is what you use to roll through your photos when you're trying to review them and skip through a set quickly. And what I find happens for me is because the dial is actually a button as well, I end up accidentally clicking it in whenever I'm rolling through, and I end up adjusting the playback volume for videos rather than skipping through the photos. It actually trips me up quite a bit. Another benefit of the Sony system is that all of the buttons can be customized to do whatever you want. To some extent, you can do this on Canon and Nikon as well, but I found that you can get more granular with the Sony controls and exactly what you want to change with those buttons. It took me a while to figure out what I wanted my button layout to be, like shooting with it for practice as well as at a couple of weddings before realizing, hey, I actually don't want this control here, or I do want this one here. You're gonna need to plan to spend some time with your custom menu set up so that you can change the buttons to suit your needs. Everybody shoots a little bit differently. There's no right answer here. I've got mine set up right now to do my main autofocus using the AF on button. I always have used back button focus, and that's something I continue to do with Sony. However, to take advantage of Sony's awesome eye autofocus system, I mapped the eye autofocus button to the AEL button that's just to the right of the AF on button. That way I can seamlessly switch back and forth between general full scene focus or specific eye autofocus. Some of the things I mapped the other buttons to were things like changing my focus zones, whether I wanted to have continuous shooting on or off, or my shooting mode, as well as silent shooting, which is a nice little benefit of this camera that I'm gonna talk about in a bit, but it's nice to have it quickly accessible when you need to be quiet. It took me around 6 weeks of practice to really feel at home with this camera. It really felt like learning a new language. When you've been working as a professional photographer, you take so many photos, like I've literally shot millions of photos on Canon cameras. It's really hard to change your muscle memory for your fingers and thumb while you're working and on the fly. One of the big benefits of Sony is gonna be having that electronic viewfinder. That means what you're looking at through the viewfinder here is not like on Canon where you're actually looking through your lens, through a piece of glass. And here it's actually a very small, high-resolution screen that shows you exactly what your photo is going to look like. It shows you your white balance, your exposure. You can have extra exposure data in there as well. So for me, I have highlight zebra stripes turned on, so if anything is going to be blown out, my camera is showing me right away in the viewfinder, and I can always correct my exposure immediately and seamlessly. There's no more chimping when you shoot with a mirrorless camera. That's really one of the biggest benefits. So chimping is when you take a photo, hold your camera down and check and say, did this turn out? Did I get the focus? Did I get the exposure right? All this stuff. If you've ever shot a wedding on a cloudy day where the sun is coming in and out of the clouds, you'll know what it feels like to be wondering, is my exposure right now? When you're shooting with a mirrorless camera, you don't have to second guess yourself. You know exactly how it's turning out. And beyond that, you have the added benefit of the high quality Sony sensors that allow you to push the shadows to get lots of data out of them. That means that you can plan to shoot for the highlights and underexpose and bring your photos up afterwards to make sure you haven't lost any information. Another benefit of the Sony system is having in-body image stabilization. So in Canon and Nikon, if you want stabilized lenses, you gotta pay for them every single time you buy a lens. It makes the lenses heavier and it also makes them cost more. Now on Sony, because you've got the stabilization on the sensor, every one of your lenses, including your fast f1.4 glass, is stabilized. When you combine that with the great high ISO ability of the camera, you can shoot in near darkness, shoot at 1/15 of a second handheld with a 35 1.4 at ISO 10,000, and you can shoot and get photos where you can't see anything with your eye, but the camera is picking it up. Now, on the flip side, something you're gonna notice right when you switch to Sony is that their menus suck. I don't know if I can really quantify why exactly they suck, but they just don't feel intuitive. Now, part of that is gonna be because I've been a long-time Canon shooter and I've become used to the Canon menus. But even after a year with the Sony cameras, I still don't feel like I thoroughly know my way around the menus. They're long and convoluted and they're not well labeled. Plus, for some inexplicable reason, Sony took away the ability to use the touchscreen when you're in the menus. Why they would do this, I don't know. Canon somehow, as a camera-only and I guess printer company, is able to give you a great fully functional touchscreen, and Sony, who makes laptops, or they used to, and phones and other technology, can't give you a great touchscreen experience. You also can't use the touchscreen to pinch to zoom on photos. You can double tap and zoom all the way in and then pan around, but on Canon, you can just pinch and zoom and quickly move in and out to review your photos and make sure you've nailed your focus and that you've got everybody's expressions looking good. So let's jump ahead to the thing that you've probably heard people talk about, the Sony autofocus system. Sony has developed this amazing autofocus system originally on their A9 sports camera and brought it into their affordable full-frame A7 III. What this means is that you've got something like 90% of your viewfinder covered by autofocus points, and all of them work equally well. You can use the eye autofocus system to track whatever eye is going to be closest to your camera, and it follows it amazingly. Whether people turn their head or close their eyes, you can trust it to nail the focus. On Canon, and to a lesser extent on Nikon, you're always going to be guessing, did I focus this correctly? Do I need to do focus recompose, or can I trust the external focus points? And even if you feel like you can trust those focus points, a lot of the time on DSLRs you actually have to calibrate your lenses to get accurate results. I've heard lots of people over the years talk about how they feel like Sigma lenses are talked about like they're so good, but then they don't focus correctly for them, and so they say they're garbage. The reality is that Sigma lenses more often need calibration than native first-party lenses for your Canon or Nikon cameras, but they offer amazing performance for the money once you've calibrated them. But calibration isn't limited exclusively to third-party lenses. Many times Canon and Nikon lenses need to be calibrated to your specific camera body in order to focus perfectly accurately. The Sony focus system is so good that you can be shooting wide open on an 85mm lens with eye autofocus turned on and have your subjects running towards you shooting 10 frames a second, and it'll get 9 out of 10 frames in focus. That's something that I just couldn't say with Canon. You may think that that seems like a ridiculous scenario, but if you've ever shot family photos with young kids, you know how challenging it can be to get kids in focus when they're running around quickly. And if you want to get those action shots of kids actually playing and not just doing smile for grandma posed photos, you're going to want an accurate focus system. And the Sony system makes it so easy to nail these. Another thing you should know about focus is that you can use your existing Canon lenses with the Sigma MC11 adapter. The autofocus is very accurate. I find that it's not quite as fast as using native first-party Sony lenses, but it's more than adequate for most situations that aren't moving quickly. So you can easily make the change by just buying the MC11 and trying out your existing lenses. Unfortunately, Nikon lenses apparently don't work as well with the adapter. Something to do with flange distance and lens design or something like that. So if you're looking to make the switch, it's an easier transition from Canon to Sony than from Nikon to Sony because you can use any of your existing Canon lenses. And most of those lenses with the adapter will still retain the eye autofocus. You still have full functionality with them, you just have an additional adapter in front. Case in point, here's my 135L with the adapter on the bottom. The adapter without the lens looks like this. The adapter also acts as a Sigma dock for any of your Sigma lenses, so if you need to update the firmware on your Sigma glass, you can use the adapter to do so. The adapter runs for about $200. So it's not exactly nothing, but it's pretty affordable if you're looking at the cost of replacing all of your lenses. The last thing I want to say about the Sony autofocus system is that it's amazing. My delivery numbers went up 40% after switching to Sony from Canon. Now some of you may think that that sounds like a bad thing if you're not wanting to add to your editing load, and I understand that. It can be a bad thing. However, to have the confidence that you're not going to be missing shots when they're coming up is so good. Something to know about eye autofocus is that generally speaking, it's going to grab the eye that's closest to you. So if you're shooting a couple or a family, it will usually grab the eye that's closest to you and track it. However, if it grabs the wrong eye, I usually find if I press the eye autofocus button again, it'll jump to another eye. The system seems to know that if I'm pressing the button again after it's been tracking an eye, that it was on the wrong one. So you're gonna need to play with this and figure out what works for you. Now, I know on Sony you have the option to calibrate your lenses, but I have to say, shooting with 6 different lenses on 2 different Sony bodies, I have never needed to calibrate any of my glass. On the flip side, when I shot Canon with my 6 lenses and 2 bodies, I had to calibrate 11 out of the 12 possible combinations in order to get accurate results. Even with all the calibration that I would do on my Canon glass, I would often second guess whether the camera actually nailed stuff, and sometimes lenses go out of calibration because they got bumped or something like that. With Sony, there's no worries like that, at least for me. The biggest challenge is making sure that you're using the correct focus mode so that you're focusing on the thing you want to focus on. This may mean jumping between single point focus, zone focus, wide mode, or covering your entire focus area. And that's just gonna take some trial and error to figure out what works for you. Another thing I was initially concerned about was what the battery life was going to be like. If I was going to have a screen running 100% of the time in the camera while I had it turned on, there was no way that this could match the battery life I had gotten used to with a DSLR. So I bought 6 batteries to start. Turns out, with my A7 III, I actually get better battery life than I did with my 5D Mark IV. I don't know how Sony managed to do it. They did make the battery a little bit bigger than Canon's battery, but the reality is that if there's a screen running all of the time, how is it they're able to outdo Canon? On the 5D Mark IV, it was rare for me to clear 2,000 images on a single charge, usually 1,800 or 1,900. On the Sony, I typically get 2,100 shots and sometimes as much as 2,400 shots. So 6 batteries for me is plenty to cover a wedding where I typically shoot around 7,000 to 10,000 images. Now, something you should know about the A7 III though is the charging system. When you just buy the camera outright, it comes with 1 battery, but it doesn't come with a wall charging brick. Instead, you actually have to plug in your camera directly to the wall using the USB-C port, and then your camera will charge the battery while the battery is inside. Now, for an enthusiast, that may be okay, but if you're working professionally, you have a lot of batteries and you're shooting a lot, there's no way that's gonna work. So what I did was pick up the Sony external 4 battery charger. So the name of the Sony battery charger is the MQZ1K, or Z1K for my American friends. It's about $400, so it's not cheap, but it does come with 2 additional batteries, which are normally about $80 a piece. So when you account for the fact that it'll charge 4 batteries at once, it can run your camera continuously as an external battery pack, and it comes with 2 batteries, the value actually isn't too bad. You can consider third-party batteries too. I have a lot of friends that use those, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. However, I've always found that I get the most performance out of first-party batteries, and on wedding days, I don't want to have to worry about it. I want the batteries to run for as long as possible, so I stuck with the Sony stuff. So let's talk about the sensor. You've probably heard about Sony file quality and dynamic range and blah, blah, blah. Maybe you care, maybe you don't. The long and the short of it is that there's great dynamic range in the files from the A7 III, and the high ISO is the best ever measured by DxOMark. We don't need to get into pixel peeping and all the numbers, but suffice to say, you're not gonna be wanting for file quality if you switch to this camera. Something else you should know about with the sensor though, is that because this is a mirrorless camera, there's no mirror to protect your sensor. With a DSLR, you may have gotten used to only having to clean your sensor once or twice a year, or at least that's what I did. With Sony, I'm literally cleaning it every week, sometimes after every shoot. I've had weddings where I cleaned my sensor before the wedding, and by the middle of the afternoon, I can see dust spots showing up. Now, maybe this is the exception, or maybe I'm being too picky about it. Generally speaking, they'll only show up if you're shooting, small apertures and wide lenses and things like that, but it's something to know about for sure. In my opinion, if you switch to a mirrorless camera for work, you should absolutely buy some kind of sensor cleaning kit, whether it's a rocket air blower or an Arctic butterfly and a sensor loop, something like that. Just be warned, there will be way more dust on your sensor than you've gotten used to. When it comes to the files themselves, if I'm shooting at ISO 50, I can comfortably push them 5 stops. This means you basically can't screw up. It's really easy to nail your exposure. And it's even easier when you consider that you can see exactly what you're getting in your viewfinder while you're shooting. So you just don't really need to worry about your exposure that much. You've got plenty of file quality to work with here. So everyone wants to know about the color. And what's the color like? Is it like Canon color? And can you get this? I have to say, it took me some time to adjust to the differences in the files. I probably spent 4 to 6 weeks figuring out my presets and tweaking my colors to get things close to where they used to be. but they'll never be exactly the same. Every sensor is a little bit different. However, I have been able to get the files to a point where I feel good about them. Did I prefer Canon color? Probably a little bit, but there's actually a really great video out there that Tony Northrup put out comparing the color differences between Sony, Canon, Fuji, and Nikon, and there are some really interesting results that I think are worth checking out. The long and the short of it is that, generally speaking, your white balance is one of the most important parts of your color. So if you can nail your white balance, you're probably going to be in good shape. But on that note, you're going to need to plan for some time to adjust your editing to suit the Sony files. I found for me personally, using a different camera profile in Adobe Lightroom made a big difference. The Sony files to me lack the warmth and oranges of Canon files, so using the Adobe Landscape preset really brought that back. It actually dialed it up a bit too much, so I find that I dialed back the saturation in the orange channel specifically. The files themselves, if you're shooting uncompressed, are around 50 megabytes. That's pretty huge. If you're shooting a wedding, that means you can easily get to 250 gigs for a single wedding. So you may find that it's worth shooting in the compressed mode, which is about 25 megabytes per file for most of your shooting, and then for the crucial bride and groom portraits and bridal party portraits, you may want to switch to uncompressed. A lot of people might not notice the difference there, but I can tell that I can push the files a little bit further if I'm shooting uncompressed compared to compressed. Now jumping to the ISO, it's very good. Not only can the ISO push higher than on the 5D4, but I like the look of the noise better when it does show up. Something about it just feels a little bit more natural. I find I can comfortably shoot up to about ISO 10,000 with this camera. Now your mileage may vary depending on your own preferences for how much grain you're willing to tolerate. My threshold is actually pretty low for that, so you may find that if you're comfortable with a lot of camera grain, you might be able to push it up to ISO 25,000 comfortably. Another feature that I was really excited about was silent shooting. Now Canon and Nikon have silent shooting modes in their cameras, which actually do work pretty effectively to lessen the amount of sound that comes out of your camera while you're shooting. This is really helpful during quiet wedding ceremonies or candid moments while people are getting ready and you're trying to be inconspicuous. Or for me, I shoot a lot of classical music concerts, and snooty patrons get angry if they hear your camera click during the concert. So this has lessened the amount of evil eyes directed my way while I'm shooting. However, you do need to know that there are some differences between using the regular shutter on the Sony, which is a standard mechanical shutter, and the electronic shutter, which is what allows you to shoot silently. The standard mechanical shutter is reasonably loud. It's definitely louder than the Canons and the Nikons when they're in the regular mode, at least to my ear. Now, when you're shooting in the silent mode and you're using the electronic shutter, the camera actually takes the photos differently. It scans the photos from top to bottom through the frame. So you can get some funny little artifacts from this as a result. The biggest thing you'll notice is that if you pan your camera quickly while you're shooting, like if you're walking or moving or look in a different direction, or if your subjects are moving quickly, is that you may find that you get a weird slant to your images. Everything just looks like it's tipping over or getting squashed. Basically, if you've ever taken a video on your cell phone and moved your phone quickly and seen that kind of jello effect, imagine that, but for still frames. As a result, I use the silent shooting mode on the Sony pretty carefully. Usually only when I know I can stand fairly still and I know my subjects aren't going to be moving much either. This way I can ensure I'm not going to get any weird jello effects and squished people. Another thing that you get when using the electronic shutter is banding from certain types of lighting. There are a lot of lights out there that flicker at 60 Hertz. That means they refresh and flicker 60 times a second. And you may find that if you shoot above 1/60th of a second, that you get weird green and purple banding throughout your frame. Now, I believe the A9 may have solved this issue, but for the A7 III, it's definitely there. So if you're shooting in a room that's lit by fluorescent lights, or if you're shooting a conference and there are projectors in the frame, just be aware that you may get banding showing up where those lights are, so you may need to switch to the full mechanical shutter. But jumping back to the benefits, it allows you to be so inconspicuous. When you combine it with the flip out screen, you can have your camera kind of at waist or chest height, be looking down at it and shooting silently the people around you, and they don't know that you're taking a photo. Sounds a little bit creepy, but when you're shooting a wedding reception and you're trying to get people just in conversation and hanging out, it's nice to not have them do the dead eye stare at you as soon as they see you point a camera their way. Instead, you can just get a quick shot and get out. Now, speaking of that flip out screen, it's useful when you're not trying to be sneaky too. Whether you're just trying to get a shot from on the ground for a low angle or a reflection, get the camera above your head, maybe on the dance floor or something like that, Or for me, something that I've really enjoyed doing is bringing the camera down to just below my chin while I'm shooting with a couple. Maybe I've got them walking towards me, and I can be making eye contact with them and directing them while shooting and trusting that the amazing autofocus system is going to keep them in focus, and I can just quickly glance down to check my composition and make sure I've got them at the right point in the frame. It literally changes the way that you shoot and allows you to engage with your subject better. Okay, so let's talk about connectivity. If you open up the side doors on the camera, you're gonna see all of the ports that you've got available to you. The big one for me is USB-C 3.1. So you can use the USB-C port to charge the camera, charge the battery. You can also use it to transfer data, whether it's transferring everything from your memory card to your computer, or the way I use it, while shooting tethered in the studio connected to my laptop. USB-C 3.1 is so fast that I can be shooting uncompressed 50 megabyte files and they'll transfer to my computer in about a second. You can take 3, 4, 5 photos in quick succession and your computer has no problem keeping up showing what you've been shooting. When I shot with the 5D Mark IV, the included tether cable was so slow by comparison. It was really frustrating. As for the other ports, you've got a headphone output, microphone input, micro HDMI, and a multi-port that looks kind of like micro USB that you can use to have a shutter remote plugged in to control the camera remotely. As for wireless connectivity, you've got NSC, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi so that you can easily pair your camera to your smartphone or laptop and send files wirelessly. This is nice when you're on the go. You just pull up the Sony app, select the photos that you want to transfer over to your phone, and press a button and they're there in a few seconds. It's pretty nice. Another very important thing that is included on the A7 III is dual memory card slots. I'm looking at you, Canon and Nikon. I was pretty curious about the new full-frame mirrorless cameras that Canon and Nikon were putting out this year, but for me, it was an instant buzzkill as soon as I saw that they didn't have dual memory card slots. If you're a wedding photographer and you've ever had a card fail on you, you know what it feels like to not trust a single card slot. I will not shoot a wedding with one card slot. I don't care what format the card is or how reliable it's supposed to be. I've had hard drives fail, I've had memory cards fail, and thankfully I've always had backups and never lost a single file for a client. And in my opinion, this is a must-have, and it was a major miss for Canon and Nikon. The Sony has 2 SD card slots. I'm not sure how I feel about this. On the one hand, it's nice to have everything be in the same format versus the 5D Mark IV, which had CF and SD card slots, but it does keep the camera smaller, but it's much less expensive than the CFast cards that are required for some of the new Nikon cameras. So something you should know about the electronic viewfinder is that when you have a flash or transmitter attached, the viewfinder automatically switches to a bright scene preview. Essentially, if you're in a dark room, it will adjust the preview settings so that it looks much brighter than it actually is, although it doesn't actually adjust the settings for your final photo. Some people like this, some people don't. You can turn it off pretty easily by just turning off your flash or turning off your transmitter just momentarily. So if you need to get a gauge of what your ambient exposure looks like, just quickly turn off your transmitter, just like that, and then look at what the room looks like. Generally speaking, I find when I'm shooting a dark wedding reception or a dance floor or something like that, it's much more helpful for me to have that bright preview while I'm shooting so I can see exactly what's going to be in focus. And speaking of which, I nail way more shots on the dance floor than I ever used to with my 5D Mark IV. The focus system is so much better. Now, the electronic viewfinder isn't necessarily the best out there. You can get a better one on the A7R III or the A9 from Sony, and I believe the new Nikons actually have a better one as well. Sony made this decision intentionally, partially to help keep the cost down and also to help improve the battery life. This gives the A7 III the best battery life out of any of the Sony cameras, and I believe better than any other mirrorless camera out there. It's a worthwhile trade-off in my opinion. You can also go into the menu and change the quality settings as you need to further improve battery life if you want. The long and the short of it is that I don't feel like the viewfinder is bad. It's adequate. It never hurts to have more resolution and sharpness, but I'm never left feeling like I'm staring at individual pixels or like it looks crappy. It's just totally adequate. And if you want, you can also turn on image review in your viewfinder while you're shooting. What this means is that you can make it so that, like on a traditional DSLR, as soon as you take a photo, you see a freeze frame of it show up in your viewfinder. Personally, I have this turned off because I find it a little bit disorienting and I don't always need to check what my photos look like because the viewfinder exposure preview gives you a really good idea of what you're getting. The times when this is most helpful for me is when I'm shooting with flash. Then I can see what my flash exposure is looking like the moment I take the photo. Some people have complained that they find it disorienting. All you have to do is go into your settings and turn off auto review, and you won't see a preview of your photos right after you take them. You do have a very brief viewfinder blackout, just like on a DSLR while you're shooting, but it's no worse, no better, about the same. And unlike with the DSLR, you can change the settings for what shows up in your viewfinder while you're shooting, so you can see a live histogram of what you're getting on screen, as well as on-screen displays for grids and composition and all that sort of thing, as well as a digital level. Ultimately, with the viewfinder, I feel like having an EVF is one of the biggest advantages of shooting with a mirrorless camera. Once you get used to having one, traditional DSLRs feel like dinosaurs. Some people don't like them. They say they make them feel disconnected somehow, and that's totally fine. It's totally a personal preference thing. Those are probably the same people who prefer the feel of a physical book over a Kindle or something like that. It's worth trying out to see whether or not it's for you. Overall, even if you're not a Sony fan, whether it's because of the color or the feel of the cameras or whatnot, a lot of Fuji shooters really like to talk about how good their camera feels and how it excites them and all this stuff, and that's great. But something that you should be grateful to Sony for is how they've pushed the industry forward. Sony passed Nikon last year, and in certain places passed Canon this year for the most full-frame camera sales. So Canon and Nikon have taken notice and started releasing their own alternatives. Competition is good for all of us. It drives product innovation, and it drives companies to try to attract new customers or bring their old ones back. So thank you, Sony, for putting out a great product at a great price, and I'm excited to see what's going to happen in this space moving forward. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Hopefully you found it was informative. If you liked it, please hit the thumbs up button below the video, and if you loved it, try subscribing to my channel. If you have any feedback for me or comments or thoughts on mirrorless cameras, Sony, or photography in general, hit me up in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks.